Can we hear each other? I think we can. Excellent. What I would, Anita, before we start, ask you whether there's somebody waiting outside that we can let them in. I guess about 10 people more. Many people registered, but they didn't show up. I guess they're still eating that great lunch. Excellent. Now I can hear myself. So hopefully those that are joining online can hear me also. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Marko Komac, and I'm representative of one of the co-organizers of this afternoon's session, Intro. The other two co-organizers are Initiative on Forensic Geology at IUGS and European Federation of Geologists. And just after my boring introductory, I'll give the floor to the representative of EFG. So I would first like to welcome everybody, the attendees, the speakers, and the listeners, and also the online participants. Ahead of us, there are 4 hours, which I think we'll spend quite efficiently, because we have really interesting topic to discuss, and we have 7 presentations in 2 sessions. First session is going to be a bit longer. It's going to have 5 talks from 15 to 20 minutes long. Don't worry if you're a bit too long, just don't be longer than 20 minutes. At the end, we'll have time for questions and answers, and if we don't address all of them, we'll also have, at the end of both sessions, at the end of the day, some time to discuss any open issues just after the roundtable discussion. So lots of discussion. Hopefully the topic is so interesting that we'll fill up the time that we have for non-official presentations and discussions. And the workshop, as you know, is addressing the responsible sourcing and traceability of critical raw materials, which is hot topic again for Europeans, and not only for Europeans, as you will see also for our colleagues overseas, and I believe all around the world. What else? Yeah, the first session is going to run up to 4 and 10, and then we'll have a half an hour break, so you can stretch your legs, have some coffee, run around the hotel, have a restroom used. Just regarding that, when you step out to the main hall, the ladies' restroom is on the left, the gentleman's is, it's on the right, the gentleman's is on the left. I just got confused. I would crash my car if I would do that on the road. So we plan to wrap up at around 6 o'clock, and hopefully you won't be too bored at that time. If you hear an emergency alarm, please follow the instructions. The signs outside the building are very well lit up when that happens. Hopefully it won't. But I guess we are all quite aware how to get out if anything happens. We did take some of your personal data when you registered, and be aware that we are following EDBR rules, so don't worry about them. And since we have 2 presentations by our colleague, Dr. Lawrence here, he's cooperating with Interpol and FBI. I do kindly ask again, it was in the announcement, but again, I kindly ask you not to take any photos and any videos during those 2 presentations. Those 2 presentations will, for those that are following us online, will not be streamed online because of the delicacy of the content. So please take that into account, and apologies for that, but that's how the rules are. So, again, very welcome to the workshop, and I give the floor, the first introductory, the second introductory, to the Executive Director of European Federation of Geologists, Mr. Glenn Burridge. Please, Glenn.
So a very warm welcome for those of you in Brussels, despite the dire climatic conditions here today. I know a lot of you will know who EFG are, but just to give you an introduction, we are the European Federation that covers the professional geological associations of Europe. We have 28 members. Under those associations sit around 40,000 geologists, individual geologists, and we cover the span of our science. And included in that is 10 expert panels. And we have one of our coordinators here, Marco, from Geohazards, and some of the experts I know from the minerals panel are here today as well. We're very heavily involved in EU-funded projects, and our purpose is to ensure ethical practice. It's the protection of the environment and the public and the responsible use of resources. So a workshop like this is very much aligned with how we see the world. And it's also significant to mention that we were involved in supporting the Conflict Minerals Directive, the 3TG one, back in 2017. That was adopted 1st of January 2021, working with partners and the European Parliament. So it's wonderful to see. Perhaps the best way I can get this across is to say that we manage the European Geologist title, and that was the original purpose of EFG back in 1980. And as part of that, each European geologist, and there's around 1,350 in the world at the moment, they sign up to a code of ethics. And I just want to read you something from what they sign up to. And it really gets across the point that ESG issues are at the heart of what we do. It is not just a technical activity that we're involved in. It's not the full story. And I quote, "The privilege of exercising our profession demands the highest standards of integrity, morality, professional conscience, and responsibility." And part of that responsibility is the impression we generate as we go about our profession. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Glenn. That was really quick and concise. Now we begin with the first presentation we have today. The two ladies gave an additional effort to prepare the presentation. With us is Miss Anna Stanker, and the presentation was also compiled, as I can say, by Dr. Fabiana Di Lorenzo, and she's not able to join us live, but she's online for any potential questions you might have later on. Ladies come from Responsible Minerals Initiative, and it's an initiative from the industry perspective. So please, Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marco. I think some technical switches. Trying to get the presentation ready. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Just checking if this moves around. Yes, perfect. So, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for having me as representative of the Responsible Minerals Initiative today. Thanks to Marco and Intrav and the co-organizers indeed for giving us this opportunity. My presentation today will focus on the role that an industry association can play in the promotion of supply chain due diligence in the mineral space. I'm likely to use a couple of acronyms when referring to the association that I represent, so I will start just with a couple of words of introduction. So the RMI, the Responsible Minerals Initiative, is an initiative of a broader business association, the Responsible Business Alliance, RBA, which essentially brings together industries that have headquarters and operating globally, and which share one common vision, that is of promoting sustainable supply chains. We represent several companies that you certainly know. So RBA has a quite wide membership, started out in the electronics industry, but over time it has really expanded to represent all those industries that might have electronics in their products. And that could be medical devices, it can be toys, it can be the retail sector, and you'll certainly recognize some of the brands there. So within the RBA, there is one initiative dedicated to responsible mineral sourcing, and that is the RMI. The Responsible Minerals Initiative, there are many initiatives which share the same acronym, so I'll try to speak it out. So the Responsible Minerals Initiative, we represent about 450 companies, indeed worldwide, and the objective of those companies is to find a collaborative space to support the execution of due diligence in their supply chains, in particular with reference to mineral sourcing. Now, the driver for the establishment of the RMI altogether is to be found in the regulations. So there have been two pieces of regulations which really shaped this space, which are the Dodd-Frank Act and the EU Conflict Mineral Regulations. And it is out of those regulatory drivers then that our member companies felt the need to join forces and to identify efficient, effective, harmonized way to execute due diligence within their supply chains down to mineral sourcing. The scope of RMI historically has been very much in line with those regulations. So we started working in the 3TG space. Gold, tin, tantalum, and tungsten have been the minerals that have been the bread and butter of our members for a long time. But that has changed significantly over the last 2 years. And again, regulations have really been the driver behind that change, and I will come back to this in a moment. Now, with the change in scope, also our membership has changed. So we not only represent downstream companies, we also represent companies in the midstream of the supply chain, smelter refiners that are operating globally. And recently we have established an investor network to facilitate dialogue between those different stakeholders, the industry and the investors, particularly around the alignment of practices and risk assessment related to mineral sourcing. What the RMI does, in a nutshell, is to be a catalyzer of collaboration. So we bring our members together and we support harmonization of due diligence practices around mineral sourcing. And what I will do today, I will use a few practical examples of how that collaboration looks like in practice, and where there are areas of collaboration where the industry indeed can come together and utilize the same tools and the same approaches in a way that we hope is effective and reduces the burden for the overall supply chains. So indeed, we said that our raison d'etre is really the need of companies to execute due diligence in the supply chains, and that is an individual company responsibility. However, while executing these due diligence measures, there are areas where companies can benefit of collective leverage, and while they can join forces to do things more efficiently and hopefully in a more effective way. And shaping those areas of collaboration is really the role that the RMI has taken. And this, of course, is born out of the idea that there are going to be a lot of inefficiencies if every company tries to set up its own system, its own procedures, its own schemes to execute due diligence, and that harmonizing, unifying approaches can be of benefit not only for the downstream, but also for the upstream companies, the smelter, the refiners, and ultimately also the mining companies, which are in a way at the recipient ends of data requirements, of information requirements, of transparency requirements. There must be an enabler for collaboration, and that enabler in our space has been found in the fact that those regulations that really drove the need for due diligence, so Dodd-Frank and the EU Conflict Mineral Regulations, have been based on the same source code, that is the OECD guidelines for responsible mineral sourcing from conflict-affected and high-risk areas. The fact that there was that common foundation has really been the enabler that then helped companies to come together around same approaches to determine mineral origin and to manage the risk that can be associated with those minerals. So in practice, what the RMI does is, on the one hand, acting as a platform for knowledge exchange and for joint action. This can be around supply chain mapping, it can be around risk assessment, it can be about risk mitigation initiatives. We create really virtual spaces, which we call our working groups, where companies from the electronics, automotive, retail sector, you name it, can come together. They can build collective intelligence on the supply chains that they are monitoring, so whether it is 3TG or other supply chains. But also importantly, they can exchange good practices to execute due diligence and seek to harmonize them. That all with the objective of reducing the burden on the supply chain altogether to comply with those requirements. But also to have an amplified impact. So using their collective leverage to be able to exercise more or to generate greater impact on those supply chains. The second area in which we operate is that of standardizing tools, so creating tools that can be used on an industry basis beyond the individual company level, so that there is, again, uniformity of approaches. And that is very much in the area of risk assessment, but also in the area of standardization of requirements, so standards and assurance, and in the areas of reporting. I will give you a few examples of how that is done in practice, how we do it at the RMI, without aiming to say that this is the perfect way of doing things. This is the way we have found to bring industry together and to build this collaborative space. And we keep working together with the industry to innovate our approaches, but also to understand what is working and what is it that is not working. I'll start from one example, that is supply chain mapping, which is maybe one of the entry points of due diligence. And I'll start by stating the obvious, that supply chains are not linear, that it's not a series of business relation linking a downstream companies, a retailer, up to the mine. They are really complex, multi-layered webs of business relations. And if you ask any of our members, they will tell us in their tier one, there are already 10 of thousands of suppliers. Each of those suppliers is sourcing from multiple suppliers, and that grows exponentially, which really gives you an idea of how gigantic the task can be of mapping out that supply chain entirely. And sometimes that is not necessary, that is not the task, because from a risk-based due diligence, it is important to be able to identify where there are risk areas and where to focus the attention and the efforts. So there is one element which is critical in that exercise, that is the identification of the pinch points. So you have this very complex web, and you have this very simplified representation of what a mineral supply chain can look like, where there is a critical, a pivotal point, that is the pinch point. The concept of pinch point is something that we derived from the OECD guidelines for responsible mineral sourcing. And essentially, the pinch point is there where the material is first aggregated and transformed. So it can be smelter, refiners, metal processors, which means at that point in the supply chain, there is the highest possibility to determine the origin of the material and also to understand the risks that are associated with the provenance of those materials. So it is on the identification of the pinch point that the members of the RMI are really focusing their efforts and working collaboratively. And the way we are doing it, again, simplifying the process, is in 3 steps: identifying, what we call the disposition process, and then recording. And the process of identification is essentially it's an exercise which it's very hard to do from a single company perspective. That's why our companies are essentially doing a collective exercise without having the ambition of identifying the smelter that precisely supplies to their company, but really aiming to identify globally in the industry who are the smelters and refiners, with whom can we work then to lift up the industry altogether so that the same standards of due diligence can be promoted at that same level. Identification usually happens with reporting templates, which are standardized in the industry, and which lead then to the collection of a minimum level of information, which is what we utilize at the RMI with internal and external expert support to determine if that company, those smelter and refiners, are actually pinch point in the supply chains, or if they are located upstream or downstream. Why this? Because depending on the position of the supply chains, there can be different requirements of due diligence that apply to that company. And the outcome of the disposition process is a public good, which is a list publicly available on our website, on which anyone can essentially look up the name of a certain facility or asset, identify whether it constitutes a pinch point, and where that facility is located at a country and region level. So the role that RMI is playing here is that of a trusted intermediary that helps in the collection of this information, in the aggregation, also helps maintaining confidentiality, commercial confidentiality, and then making publicly available the level of information that can help the industry as a collective. A second area where there is very good potential for industry collaboration is the risk assessment. So again, one of the initial steps of due diligence, and there, of course, every company can establish its own methodologies to understand risks related to a country or to a material. What the RMI has been called to do by its members is to standardize a methodology to determine risks and to identify, on the one hand, conflict-affected and high-risk areas, determining what is the level of risk, is it low, medium, high, but also, on the other hand, really looking at what is the association of certain materials with environmental, human rights, and governance-related risks. So out of that standardization of methodology and of indicators and risk thresholds, we have developed a digital platform that summarizes this information in a much more digestible way for our members, and that look at risk at country level, but also risks at material level. And the way we are looking today at risk at material level is determining the level of associations between a certain material and the risk areas, the issues that are publicly reported. So this is not a desk-based saliency assessment. There is much more that could be known around those materials, but we felt that a first level of information is really looking at what is publicly reported, what do we know from existing reports from reputed sources about the association of those materials with certain risks. Another areas indeed where collaboration has been possible historically is that of the definition of standards applicable to mineral supply chains. I think it's not a surprise that the RMI is a standard setter and a scheme holder. So we don't run third-party assessment, but we define the standards that are then used by auditing companies to conduct those assessments. And there are two family of standards. The first one, again, stemming out of that original work around the 3TG, that looks at the due diligence on responsible mineral sourcing for the risks that the OECD defines as Annex 2 risks. Those standards have been, again, originally designed for the 3TG sector. What has changed over the last few years is that those standards have now become applicable to any material and any type of mineral supply chains, whether it is a company producing, transforming one material or multiple materials, because of the need really to expand the scope of due diligence and go beyond 3TG. And the second family of standards is related to the ESG, again reflecting that expansion in the scope of risk assessment that we have seen. Critical for us is also that those standards are not only uniform tool for our companies, but also that they have market acceptance and that they correspond to what the regulators want to see used in the supply chains. So we are working closely with the EU legislators and regulators to achieve a recognition under the conflict mineral regulations, but we have also worked closely with several commodity exchanges, the London Metal Exchange being an example of it. We have also worked with national commodity exchanges in India or in Indonesia, for instance, to make sure that our standards can be used by those commodity exchanges in the framework of their own responsible sourcing programs. Now, looking ahead, what is it that we see? I think I mentioned several times there has been a very strong evolution of the due diligence requirements in the last 2-3 years. And that evolution goes in several directions. On the one hand, we went from regulatory requirements related to 3TG to regulatory requirements that relate to battery materials, to critical raw materials. So really there is an expansion of the type of materials on which downstream companies are required to conduct due diligence. And those materials are not only the virgin materials, they are also, and increasingly so, scrap and recycled materials. The second trend that we see is that, again, there is an expansion in the scope of the risks that are to be monitored. Traditionally, OECD Annex 2 risks, so association with the armed conflict, with corruption, with the most severe risk to human rights, were strongly in focus. That is still the case, but it is no longer sufficient. So companies are really called to know and to manage risk related to environmental impacts, to occupational health and safety, to worker rights, to governance in general. So there is a scope, a thematic expansion of due diligence. And finally, we should also keep in mind that there is a different driver, that is the driver towards diversification of supply chains, driven really by concerns of resilience and security of supply, which means that new projects, mining projects, are in the exploration or commercialization stage in countries that do not have a tradition of executing due diligence. And that means for our members the need to engage with new players, institutional players, private sector players in those geographies. So all of this comes to us as an industry association as an ask for our members to find tools and to define these industry-wide approaches to go with, to keep abreast of the changes, which means on the one hand that all our tools are becoming mineral agnostic tools. We have mineral agnostic standards which can be deployed with companies, within companies that are sourcing and transforming multiple metals in an effort to increase the efficiency. Not 1, 2, 3 audits at one company, but really one audit with uniform parameters that can be deployed across different materials. Our member companies are also working very actively on a set of materials that represent strategic priorities for them. You have them mentioned there: lithium, nickel, cobalt, copper, rare earth elements, and mica are really top of mind for our member companies. The second element is this expansion of thematic due diligence, whereby we have been called by our members to raise the bar of what are the ESG due diligence requirements, to align them with international conventions and with the global framework agreements to which our companies, our member companies, are subject, which means a revision of our standards and really a tightening and clarification of all the requirements around ESG risk areas. And finally, supply chain mapping is changing. It is no longer strictly focused on DRC and covered countries, and China, of course, but it's becoming much more geographically distributed. You have a little snapshot of the geographic distribution of the facilities in our system at the moment, which is far from representing all the assets which are in operations. But you see the level of diversification. Latin America, the US, Europe, Australia, Southeast Asia are really becoming important focus of attention when it comes to deploying this new generation of due diligence. We see a challenge in this because there's a lot of pressure and a lot of tension and need to extend due diligence in many different directions. But at the same time, there is also a lot of momentum, and I think we should focus also on that in the sense that with this integrated approach to due diligence and with the need to really be coherent across different materials, there is a very good opportunity to amplify the impact and to extend the effectiveness that those due diligence requirements can have. So we are working in that direction. We are really keen to learn from other industry players and other stakeholders what is learning, what is not learning, what is working, what is not working, and what we can take away to improve our approaches. And that's the reason we're here, to engage in this dialogue. So we're happy to hear from the audience your suggestion, your feedback, and also to take any questions for clarifications. With this, thank you very much. I don't know if there are immediate questions or later.
Yeah, okay, now you can hear me. Thank you, Anna. I think we'll have the questions at the end.
Perfect.
So please hold to those questions that might have arisen, because I think there will be some redundancy within questions
Perfect.
during the different presentations, focusing in the same direction. So thanks again, very interesting. We've seen that the challenges responsible resourcing is facing are huge. And the next presentation is going to be showing us what could be one of the solutions to these challenges. And I kindly ask Mr. Nathan Williams from MineSpider to give his presentation on the topic MineSpider from mine to manufacturer traceability. Please, Nathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Hope everything is good. It was kind of a funny story on the way here while we get the slides up. I'm actually giving two different presentations. I got them confused, so I'm getting the correct slides up as we speak. What I want to talk about today is a little bit of our work that we're doing in the chain of custody sector. So this is going to be more focused on the mine to smelter link, but then how that ends up going into manufacturing. Now, there we go. Here we go. So those of you who don't know, MineSpider is a supply chain traceability platform. We have been in operation since 2017. We've conducted end-to-end traceability mine to manufacture with companies such as Google, with Cisco, with Volkswagen, and this has been predominantly in 3TGs, most prominently within tin. When we were doing our early work in tin, and this is what I would want to talk about a little more, is that we ended up doing a complete chain of custody. And this is how people approached traceability back in the day, is that what we wanted to do is collect every step along the supply chain from mine to manufacturer. That was sort of like the golden approach. And in doing that first project, we found out that it doesn't work very well. So, what we ended up doing in that project is we ended up tracking all the way from point of extraction till when the material ended up in a cell phone and in a car, and that's wonderful. The only problem is it requires a lot of coordination in order to work well. You end up needing people in the mid-tier supply chain to participate. You end up needing a lot of identity preserving technology in the early phases. And the problem is that it's fine to do that in a proof of concept mode, but when you try to do it at scale, it doesn't scale very well because real companies have multiple departments that have to be involved. They've got multiple customers that they're selling to, and you have a lot of mixing that happens necessarily. So we ended up, we still contain this vision of how we want to have traceability become the norm rather than the exception. However, what we saw in doing this is that a lot of the drivers for the early efforts, the supply chain traceability end-to-end, were coming from the downstream, right? The downstream has a lot of the money, it has a lot of the impetus, and we often speak about traceability from the point of view of the downstream companies, or at best from the point of view of regulators, where we want to get the data. We want to make sure there's no harm in our supply chains. We want to make sure that we're not contributing to child labor, slavery, and this sort of thing. And this is a normal thing to want to do. But when we started talking to upstream suppliers, we saw a very common pattern. And the pattern was that the ones that were doing the most end up feeling that every new initiative was an additional burden. And the ones that didn't care continued to not care. And so with this idea, we said, well, maybe there's a different way of organizing this traceability mechanism so that it's from the point of view of the supplier. If you think about it, the downstream, even though that they have the most impetus and the most pressure on them to achieve traceability and sustainability, they often run into a problem. And the problem is this: you've got 5,000 tier 1 suppliers for an average automotive. This leads to 20,000, 30,000 tier 2s, maybe 100,000 tier 3s. This leads to an enormous amount of data and difficulty in collecting the data that you would normally run into if you were trying to approach this from a downstream perspective. Now, let's just take one element of what would go into maybe a battery passport or into a vehicle passport: carbon emissions, right? Everyone is interested in carbon emissions. Trying to collect the data from a downstream perspective is a nightmare, because if you think about how you would collect data from all of those suppliers, you have to have an army of people. Army of people will go out and call their tier 1 suppliers. They would onboard them, etc. This might take a year, 2 years, 3 years, just to go through the list, and the ones who respond to you, will just provide some of the data. The rest has to be assumed. And so then what? You've got a 3-year waiting period, and with imperfect data at the end in order to calculate your Scope 3 emissions. And so it effectively becomes a way of pushing off having to do a report and then make any change for 3 years. Then at the end of it, you've got a number and a result. The number and the result is maybe 6 gigatons. What are you going to do with that? Offset it? No. It's too much. There aren't that many projects in the world. So the thing is, it's a bit of a losing battle to start from the perspective of the downstream. Start from the perspective of the upstream, and then what you can do is you can start with a product passport. And this idea is basically saying that the information should be flowing from the upstream to the downstream, that upstream suppliers should become more service providers, and this solves the traceability problem. Now, it's not a magic bullet solution, but this is our working hypothesis and approach to this problem in the market right now. So the idea here is that instead of going to all of your suppliers and asking for multiple rounds of information, and so then a supplier receives 1,000 different questionnaires from each of their downstream customers, that instead the suppliers of commodities would move to becoming more like service providers. So they would attach information about their emissions, the supply chain information that they know, recycling information, ESG, location, export licenses, etc., to the materials themselves. So you've got certain information that's going to be relevant to the company, as well as certain information that's relevant to the material. And so those can be linked together, ultimately showing a supply chain history, but it's not the end of the world if you don't go end to end, because it can be built up over time. The problem we always ran into with downstream focused approaches is that it needed large multinational corporations to agree to share data before they even began any project. And so this could lead to a delay of 6 months, a year, while legal got involved, tech got involved. Whereas, with this approach, one company can make a decision, and then they can start pushing data. Now, then you run into the next sort of level of problem. I'll go to that in a second. The next sort of level of problem, which is how to incentivize this, right? Because we're talking about ESG. We're talking about sustainability, responsibility. How do you make a company that is like in a mine site want to provide this information? We've spoken to a lot of the multinationals. Most of them wanted to be transparent as a strategy, but very few wanted to go first. So this is an ongoing challenge. Our thesis in this market is to approach it from strategy, right? So you've got regulations. Regulations such as the European battery passport. This puts pressure on the downstream. So we've created this battery passport, and the battery passport requires end-to-end traceability. maybe not of the material, but at least of supply chain maps in order to conform with the EU battery regulation. And so for sure that this provides pressure, and eventually, indirectly, all of these upstream suppliers, if they're going to want to have access to the market, will need to provide data. And so we basically made a consortium, we put together the battery passport, and we started doing this tracking. And what we found is that companies were reluctant to pay for it. So then we offered it for free, and companies were still reluctant to adopt it. And this made us ask a question as to why. Because, I mean, battery passports are specifically very complex, but when you get into the components that go into the battery passport in the upstream, they're not that complex. It's just, but it's still additional work that these companies had to do. It's still, they needed someone to understand it, some reason to adopt traceability, some sort of way of selling it to the C-level. So this is maybe a better one. For us, it's just, for us, battery passports and product passports are two types of the same type of thing. And you can see one here if you wanted to scan it. But the idea here is that attaching the digital information and making it sort of streamlined for a company to provide this would be a way of overcoming this challenge. Now, what I think is the watershed moment was something, oh, sorry, I see some people are still trying to scan that. What I think is the watershed moment was having something, was something that happened just 2 months ago. So we started working with a company called Minsur in our original end-to-end traceability pilot that we did back in 2019. And we've been working with them for quite a while, and they recently made a big announcement that they're going to track 100% of their minerals, of their tin output using MineSpider. Now, when this happened, what we saw was that a number of companies wanted to follow suit. It's one of these early adopter type of situations where when someone goes first, others are interested to follow. And it answers this question of how do we make it worthwhile for the upstream to take the lead? Well, when you start moving it away from compliance and into strategy, into we want to be the most traceable product, we want our products to be distinguishable from other anonymous products on the market, then, or we want to be service providers to the downstream, that provides a lot of the momentum for these companies to get started. So what we were thinking is, okay, we have basically three pillars of incentive that we wanted to discuss with these companies, which was, demonstrate traceability. People are demanding it. People are going to demand it. It's going to be sort of a baseline requirement, but you can be first. Avoiding product theft. This was one thing that we were talking with companies and we had sort of mixed results with. The real one was distinguishing the brand by showcasing commitment to transparency. Most of the companies that were the early adopters in this were ones that wanted to, that were appearing at events at the European Union or at OECD, or trying to be really engaged with discussions on supply chain transparency. So the idea is, if this is really hard for people to do, if it's really difficult for humans to understand supply chain maps and that it ends up being a flood of information, is it possible that the products tell the story themselves? Can we make it so that instead of us trying to gather data on the products just tell the story? So again, this is what we were saying. We have just done this project with Minsur. This was financed in part by the European Commission's work with us and in part by some of our partners. And the idea here is that we can't control the midstream, and often traders are sort of the end point. But because these operate as linkable tags, if a trader doesn't participate and just sends the material on to their next customer, the next customer can still scan the QR code, still act as a recipient, and then still make that link across the trading gap. Okay? So this is how we have approached the problem. We've already been receiving requests from 2 stages beyond MinSur for requests to how do we access the program, how do we participate, how do we add our information and send it on. So this, I think, is a very interesting approach. It is a little bit different, though, because you have less control over the outcome. So anyway, that was this presentation. We got 30,000 tons tracked, only 299,970,000 tons more to go for the green transition, but we are on the way. I am open to hearing some questions, and one thing I didn't touch on is what we do in places that do require chain of custody. So we do work as well in places like the Great Lakes region, where we are doing mine to smelter chain of custody, where you do need that unbroken link. But this is more on the industrial side, but I think I'll pause here for any questions, because I've been speaking for about 15 minutes.
Well, thanks, Nathan. We have time for one quick question, and then we'll wrap it up and address the issue at the end of the session at the questions and answers. Do we have any question from the audience regarding this? If not, I have one. You said the first adopters are the biggest challenge. Who starts first? What is the drawback that sets them back to decide?
There's a lot. But I think that one of the big ones is that everyone knows transparency is the future, but if you're a big company and you have multiple products, maybe some of them are very good relative to the world average in terms of emissions or ESG, and some of them aren't. And they don't want to be forthcoming with that information, because then they have to fix everything at once. And so it becomes a bit, the bigger the company, the harder it is for them to get started.
So it's an internal issue because the part of the production is well managed regarding traceability, the other one is not, and that spoils the good look, right?
Well, exactly. And the thing is, it's not just good look. I mean, there's a classic example from the early days of the Dodd-Frank Act, where some of the large electronics companies tried to be forthcoming with information. Hey, we found problematic mine sites in our supply chain, and they were immediately sued, right? And so there's a difficulty in this balance between wanting to be transparent and not punishing the ones that are trying to be, first movers and clean up the act.
Okay, thanks. Let's keep the momentum for the last part of the session for questions and answers. And thanks again, Nathan.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So the next speaker on our program is Jean-Claude Gienot from BRGM, that's French Geological Survey. And he's going to do the presentation on one of the very interesting projects that is ongoing, Africa Mawal. And the title will be Sustainable Investment with Added Value in Africa and Responsible Sourcing for CRM for Europe. So the title already says it by itself. With responsible investments, we can start also the process of responsible chain of critical raw materials. Jean-Claude, please, the floor is yours.
Merci, Marco. So Marco is telling that Africa Mawal is an interesting project because he's part of the project, so he has to assume what he's doing. And so we will not speak about traceability as such in comparison with the previous presentation, but we are looking at a win-win solution for Africa, or partly, with a sustainable investment and a responsible sourcing. So sustainable investment for Africa. So all investment we are speaking about are and will be in Africa. And the responsible sourcing is for the European industry as much as we can. So it's a win-win situation. So I am the coordinator, and Carol Zamit, who is here, is the vice coordinator. the project. So it's a research program, Horizon Europe, but the first sentence of the bid was, "This is not a research program." So it's something very practical, but so the DG Growth succeed to get money from DG Research, which is not every day. But in fact, we work also with a contribution from UK RI, because we have some partner from UK, and we have also a partner from Switzerland, with a huge contribution, in fact, from the Swiss part, because they put more than 1 million euro. So the global objective of the project is not something which is unusual. So access to mineral resource, we have been speaking about it this morning in the two panels we have seen on the technical and the financial aspect. And so what we think is that, and it's globally the strategy of the European Union, is to have establish some strategic partnership between Europe and African countries. So at our level, in fact, we work at the level of the continent with all the 54 countries of Africa, and the African Union is, going step by step, signing agreement with Namibia, with Zambia, with DRC. So they want also to focus on some specific countries. But anyhow, we will continue to work everywhere in Africa. But so we use 2020 list of critical raw materials. So we extended at the time with copper, nickel, tin, and manganese, which were not on the list and which are important for some countries in Africa, especially copper, clearly, but even manganese when you speak about Gabon, for example. So the partnership is original because, in fact, we have partners coming from Europe, so European Union, Europe in the wider sense with Switzerland and UK, but also with partners from Africa. And so it's not always possible. We have some INPA project in which we work in close cooperation with our African partner, but they cannot be an official partner because of European consideration. Here, they are full partners, and in fact, two of our African partners are work package leader. So I will come back on that. So it's partly non-profit organization, partly NGOs, partly geological survey, partly private company. So it's a very challenging, in fact, partnership. But anyhow, the project even globally is a challenge. So we want a responsible sourcing. We want also to have something sustainable. That means we don't want to make a coup in one country for one project and so on, but establish a link will remain after the end of the project. And so I will speak. And so this project will end up at the end of 2025, so we still have some time to work on it. We put all the structure in place, and so we'll start to develop the proposal, and in fact to validate the proposal with the global partnership. And so we have these two aspects: building an EU and Africa business network and something continuous. So I was speaking just before to come with Bernd Schäfer from the EIT Raw Material. And so it's an important project for them as a source of potential investment in Africa. And so André is there for the EIT Raw Material, so if you need question. But so that is on the European side, there is an interest, there is an organization and so on. We need to do the same on the African side that we don't have. And so we build a platform. I will show you with one of the African organizations, and that will allow us, in fact, to get some possibilities of investment. And after we have to analyze it and say if we validate it, and from there we will go to the idea of going to get investment. In fact, for not all the proposal, but for we hope the big part of it. So without entering into the detail, what we do in the point number one, we look at the potential of of the countries in Africa. So it's something that we know already, but we develop also some tools such as predictivity maps. So because you know Africa globally is underexplored if you compare with Canada or Australia, and from the data that we have, we can expand in fact the knowledge and say, okay, we didn't do so much exploration in this part of the country, but we think that we may find CRM, because also CRM was not the target of most of the exploration projects in the past. It was mainly basic minerals and metals, and but with artificial intelligence and view and so on, knowing what we have around, we may also design some places where we can have some interesting possibilities. Also, we have to look at all value chain, and we do the analysis for the global continent of the value chain for minerals. And it's done by DMT, an engineering company. We identify the financial instruments. So some of you were this morning with the session organized by Andor Lips, who is part of the project too, and he's on the financial part. And so we have all the financial instruments globally, but also country by country, because some development agencies, for example, are selective in terms of country. Danida, the Danish development agency, has been selecting 9 countries in Africa. So how, why, I don't know, but we need to know that, because if we need their help. And the main part is number 4. It's where we put the most money, and it's on the ESG condition of the proposal. And this work package is managed by AVIMA, which is the Association of Women in Mining in Africa. So it's an NGO. It's the first time they are active in a project. Before they were always there to say, we are. So just to show that they were women somewhere. But here they are managing the work package with the support of Intro, because so they are newcomer in such a project. But so it's a key point for us. And the point 5 is managed by MADI, which is a Mineral African Development Institution, and which is based in Uganda, but with several antennae in Africa. And they have the big challenge, and also helped by Intro, to make a matchmaking system to communicate with the ERMA one, but also with the development agency, with the European Investment Bank, with the development agencies such as the French AFD or German KfW, and so on. So here there is a challenge. You see that here we are in the middle of technical, financial, entrepreneurial part, and so we are not in our zone of comfort, and it's why I told you that this type of project is really a challenge. And after with EIT Raw Materials, so we develop a common strategy between the EU and Africa for the value chain with the different changes. And after we identify the opportunities, and we will validate all together at least 100 responsible proposal of investment. And so that is the target before the end of the project. And but which is also important is that we are not doing something for getting a few projects, but we want to have something permanent and create a communication between the country. So if you, as I told you, we work on the whole continent, but as a test somehow, we start to do 10 case studies with a very different situation. It shows that between South Africa and Gabon, for example, you don't have the same type of minerals and the same mining potential. And if you compare Madagascar and Morocco, you don't have the same political situation and the same stability in terms of development of business. So we took very different things. So the 6 first were given by the African Union and the European Commission, and we select the 4 last one because we feel that it was important to have Tanzania, Madagascar as a potential provider, and Morocco and South Africa as existing provider for CRM. But once again, these case studies are finishing this month, where, you know, I told you the project is finishing at the end of 2025. So it's a testing step, but that will also give us a lot of information. And looking at this country, we have already more than 100 investment proposals at different scale. Because, in fact, what we want is, once again, this network. We want also to develop, communicate about the best practice in terms of ESG, because it's not something which is very well known everywhere. And we work all along the value chain. That means it's mining, mineral processing, refining, up to the end product. But we want to have also project on energy, because in some African country, the main limitation is the energy management. And also on infrastructure. So we have also the European Investment Bank, for example, with us. So if they want, they can put on the table a few billions of euros if needed on big infrastructure. So we have been speaking this morning a lot about the investment between Zambia, DRC, Angola, in fact, to have a view on the western side for the copper, and a corridor which is going to be sponsored by the European Union partly, and that will cost a lot of money. So we have also a recycling project. We are looking at large-scale mining, but also especially with organizations such as Avima, but also the World Resource Forum from Switzerland, and Levin Sources from England, who are very well known for artisanal mining. In fact, we are looking also at artisanal mining. So artisanal mining for CRM, it's maybe 5% of the global artisanal mining. It's nothing in terms of people in comparison with gold in Africa. But still on coltan, on cobalt, but even on tin, on tungsten in Uganda, you have some place for improvement, and to avoid or to organize the work, and so provide some equipment and so on, and also to send the kids at school and not in the field. So we have a wide advisory board, or some are there, but just to show the diversity, because so Ibrahim Shaddad is from the African Mineral Geoscience Center, so it was called the CIMIC. It's in Dar es Salaam. It's a center of training, and now also it's an African Union agency. So it's an interesting player for us. So Bernd Schaeffer from the European Raw Materials Alliance. So Bernd Schaeffer is the president of EIT Raw Materials, and Erma is part of EIT Raw Materials, so he's president of both of them. So he's there also. Alain Gounod from the Geological Survey of Namibia, and working also on the Commission from Geological Map of the World. Nelly Moutiremi, who is the chairwoman, in fact, of our advisory board. She has a wide experience, and she's working on for her own for several organizations, OECD, European Union, and so on. And she's also professor at the University of Wits. And what is unusual is that we have DigiGrow in our advisory board. So it's the first time I see that, but they wanted to be there. So it's Elena who is member. We have the IGF, the International Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Minerals, Metal, and Sustainable Development, with Isabelle Hamdou, based in Paris. So it's an international organization, so based mainly in Canada, but doing every year a meeting in Geneva. And actually, so they are mainly based in Paris for personal reason. And also we work with the African Development Bank. Jerry is the chief of the mineral side of the African Development Bank in Abidjan. We have GIZ, who was with us also this morning, and WWF. And so Tobias will do a presentation the day after tomorrow at the Rio Tinto Anglo-American event. We have also the OECD with Mr. Maréchal, who is with us today. and also the World Bank with Sven Runner. So just to show the diversity also of our advisory board, we work really closely with them, and we get in touch regularly, and especially for the futures. What could be the future? In fact, since the beginning, we don't want to do Africa Maval 2. So we have another project on training, which is Panageo. We have done Panageo 2, because training is an eternity. So even if we have been training 2,000 experts in Africa from geological survey, we can continue continuously. And also we add new topics to diversify, in fact, the activity of the geological survey in Africa. But Africa Maval is not something that we want to maintain, because what we want to do is to transfer it, in fact, to an African structure. So the African structures that we target is the AMDC, which is the African Mineral Development Center, which is also an agency of the African Union. But actually, in fact, there are 4 people. So we need to strengthen them before. So they are the key point of the African mining vision. So a lot of things we speak about, you know, the AMREC, PARC, which is the African version of UNFC from United Nations and so on. But there are 4. So we'll do something in between. First, we will try now and these days to get some to hire some additional people in their team. But also we will make a project where there will be a co-leader, in fact, to help them to appropriate, in fact, all the Africa Maval tools and network and so on, and to have enough money, to have enough people to be able to work correctly. Because when you are 4 with only 2 technical people, you cannot afford, in fact, to manage such a system. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jean-Claude. I believe there are some questions, but again, since we are on time, let's keep them for the end part, and we'll address them after all the presentations are done. You okay with that?
With pleasure, my dear. Yeah.
Thank you again. Thank you for your attention. So now I give the floor to Dr. Lawrence Donnelly. He's one of the people to be blamed that you are here today, because it was his initiative and his idea. So not only forensic initiative, but also workshop on forensic initiative. Lawrence, please, the floor is yours. Frank. He told me secretly, but I'm going to reveal it now at the beginning, that he's going to drop some quite interesting, provocative topic upon us, upon European, because he's going to talk from the American perspective, which is a bit different than the European one. So it might sparkle some ideas, some objections, some nodding, but that's why we are here for, to discuss it, and I look forward to your presentation. So Chris, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So really appreciate this opportunity, and we're now going to move up to the 30,000 foot level, coming from my background, basically looking at where geology fits within the economy. Going to take a sort of a political economics view of this issue, particularly in the framework that we have in the United States and the environment we're in, which really is one of the big questions is, how do you enable this responsible sourcing in a very complicated capitalistic system like Western Europe and the United States? Because I think one of the key things is we all agree we want to do this. I think you can ask most companies, they want to do this, but will they? That's one of the big questions in the environment. And in the United States, we have 628,000 currently operating manufacturing companies. So that's a huge population. We want to try to move as much of that population forward as we can. So when you look at US policy process, which is obviously a big driver in this whole thing, national security, in the US, that's a full stop. That everything will drive right onto national security issues, and materials is very high up in that issue for the US right now. Supply chain stability, and we won't talk about who, but competitor denial. These are long-term strategies the US has. We have huge investments going through the US Department of Defense, related to this, as well as now with the infrastructure bill. The other big thing is maximizing capital returns within the economy. And post-pandemic has really actually helped, I think, our cause, because it has brought sensitivity to supply chains, to everybody, from the consumer all the way through the entire corporate structure. So things like cost control and stability are really important. And of course, we have economic growth and diplomacy, which actually in the US framework still is actually national security. You look at DoD's strategic plan, those are considered the two top threats to US national security is economic instability and failures in diplomacy. But I think one of the big things that you have to understand in the US is you cannot underestimate the Citizens United ruling in 2010, which basically said corporations have the same constitutional rights as an individual. So if you want to know why the US seems to have a lot of soulless legislation, because the corporations have a lot of say now. So obviously we have to talk about Dodd-Frank. I think the thing a lot of folks have to keep in mind, particularly in light of things like Citizens United, is it a disclosure-only regulation? You just have to say, you just have to file the paperwork, and you have to just make the best effort in your statements. And that was great. At the beginning, it scared a lot of companies, and a lot of folks got on board. A lot of people said, hey, this is a good idea, and let's move forward. But as we've moved on, one of the challenges, Dodd-Frank, great legislators, wish we had some of them right now, but it was relying on reputational pressures. How does that play in this kind of a market? And so one of the key things that happened immediately, Dodd-Frank, all components of it, but particularly Section 1502, was attacked as being an undue burden on corporations. And then one of the other sides that you have is in the US, to have a regulation actually have teeth, it actually has to get enforced. And there's 3 layers. Once you have that, there are 3 layers that have to work together to actually make it have teeth. And when the Trump administration came in, basically the teeth were pulled out from Dodd-Frank. And really the Biden administration hasn't necessarily been able to roll a lot of stuff back forward on this and others because it's a lot harder to recreate than it is to destroy. And right now, no one wants to touch anything on Dodd-Frank because one of the biggest political hot potatoes in the US is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That's being litigated on constitutional issues, and that's wrapped up in Dodd-Frank as well. So from the nasty politics in the US, no one really wants to touch this issue. We just want to take, I'll say, the inspiration from it. But you ask most Americans about Dodd-Frank, the ones that actually paid any attention, and you ask, so responsible sourcing, conflict minerals, why did they target this through the SEC? A lot of people, that's a mystery. Because they did understand you want to change operations in the US, you have to hit the core of corporate decision making. You got to change how the companies are working, you move the economy. But the challenge you face in that, if you're trying to promulgate these kinds of efforts, is the biggest return of investment for a corporation relative to policies, particularly if something maybe is an undue burden, is legal counsel, lobbyists, and think tanks. Because what they can do is start plucking away at the laws. They can get new legislation added. They can have lawsuits. They can do all kinds of stuff. Think tanks are great at influencing, the policymakers in their hearings and tweaking things, and that's what we've seen. We've seen it sort of plucked around. So the question is, we can take this philosophy that I think we all agree to, and I think a lot of companies do, but how do we actually get the bulk of groups playing? And it's further challenged because this same kind of mode that we have has influenced our tax policies. So if you look in 1951, the US corporate tax rate was 54% with 48% effective. It's almost 6% of GDP. Companies were incentivized to invest back in themselves because it was that or pay Uncle Sam. Today it's 21%, but it's only 9% effective. They have plucked away so much at it that there are all these opportunities. What this has done, dropping it to 1%, so our corporate tax are 1% of GDP, it has just unleashed huge amounts of corporate cash into the market. And that changes, and you can see it, you look at economists who analyze this impact, you see declines in investments by companies internally on innovation, labor, capital assets, relative to the revenue. And what you see is a bigger focus on short-term cash flow out for shareholder return, stock buybacks, things like that. So there's a very, very high cost sensitivity that you find in a lot of companies, particularly manufacturers. So really what it's about in our case is we can't really use the stick too hard. We got to convince folks how to do this voluntarily. And there's some short-term processes, regulations or rules. They do, when they first introduced, they have bite and they work until they are otherwise eroded away. But the big one that the U.S. uses, government subsidies. Direct subsidies are classic. Oil and gas industry, agriculture in the U.S. have huge constant direct subsidies, but most of the time they don't last. And the infrastructure bill is a classic example. It's a bunch of direct subsidies out. It is driving a lot of raw material policy right now, but don't expect that to last and be still in place in another 5 to 10 years. Purchase agreements is the historical approach that the U.S. has done in strategic management of raw materials, back to the stockpiling during the Cold War. You see that right now with some of the investments they made into, DoD has made into Canada and Australia, with some of their mineral resources to secure supplies. And obviously tax advantages being one of the other key areas. And I think the real creative one, and I think one of our greatest leverages, are the free trade agreements on raw materials that the Biden administration is pursuing. We popped that one up with Japan out of the blue, sort of surprised everyone. Obviously, they're working with the European Union. We're back and forth in Indonesia, and I'm sure we'll see others come. But this creates an interesting viral network. So the U.S. may not be in a position to have real teeth on responsible sourcing, but if the supply chains are going through partners, trusted partners who are, that helps actually build the quality of the supply chain for U.S. manufacturers in both directions, because in essence, those regulations are being promulgated without actually being legislated directly. And so the other side is, what do we do in the long term? So the short-term response is the free trade agreements and things like the Infrastructure Act are going to have great opportunities. We need to get companies to sort of get in the habit. We've heard a lot of great solutions today. The other approach, or what I'll call the policy Congo lines, how we got our environmental regulations in the U.S. You just keep flooding incremental legislation through the process, and it builds up basically a corpus in the U.S. code and sticks. But the biggest one is creating the business advantage. And I look at it as there's sort of these 4 areas that really you need to capture here. If you look at sort of the bulk manufacturing sector, negligible, you got to make this process a negligible cost. Trade group acceptance, that's another thing. Everyone wants to be with the cool kids. Make it part of a bigger business solution. In essence, a better mousetrap, and make sure that there's market growth opportunity. I think the first 2, we've already heard a lot of good ideas. I think we're going to see a lot of good ideas too. I want to talk about the other 2. Again, they're sort of at this 30,000 foot level. Because one of the things, when you look at the economics and consumer literature, you ask about ethical sourcing of material and in their products, and you ask them, what is the price for choosing to buy something ethically? What's your stated preference, willingness to pay? And people come up with an actual number, and then you test it, and they actually don't. They go buy the cheapest version of whatever it is. And there's plenty of examples of that within the end market. So whether that's happening at the consumer that's going to Walmart or at the intermediate purchasing for a small manufacturer, you basically have that challenge when it comes down to that market decision. And even when you hit things such as something people are sensitive to, a food item, 49% of Americans said, we don't really want to eat GMO food. So the government said fine, and they have it all labeled, and it has absolutely zero impact on consumer behavior. So this is a challenge. So how do we keep moving this forward? And so another key example, though, is if you take it away from sort of the embedded commodity to the direct commodities, things like fair trade coffee and craft beers in the U.S., they're more expensive, but they are in essence a direct way for the consumer, in this case, making an ethical sourcing decision. And in the U.S., what's interesting is, so basically if you go to that, I'll say farm to table kind of beer market, you're talking about 4% of the U.S. beer market, and you compare that in scope. Bud Light, Ambev, has lost $5 billion in sales so far this year over a social media faux pas. So this is not a big chunk, but there is this persistent component. Same thing with coffee, fair trade coffee, 6% of the US market currently. And people make that as a very explicit decision. You can buy regular straight coffee for about 12 euros a kilo. If you want to go fair trade, it's starting at about 30 euros a kilo in the United States. These are consumers that are making active decisions in this process. And what's interesting is then when you look at the securities market and you dig through all the SEC filings, only 5% of currently listed market funds in the United States actually consider ESG ratings in their portfolio decisions, and only up to a 0.2% premium. What I find interesting is you're looking at 5%. So you have 5% of the US market, basically, in any way you slice it, is I'll call an activist consumer mindset. And that will propagate pretty much up and down your supply chain. Now, that might not seem like a lot. That's bigger than the population of Australia, though. So it is a worthwhile area for folks to look at. And so I think one of the things that we're looking at is creative solutions. And so, with the demise of things like just-in-time inventory, certainly at least for U.S. manufacturers post-pandemic, they'd love to get back there, is, in the whole concept of supply chain monitoring, can we make that supply chain monitoring writ large, not just the sourcing? It's not just the who, but the how much and the when in that supply chain. Can they start to have insight into building up their reliability? It's a very complex issue. They can really only talk down one level, but that means basically a sequence of folks to talk with. We saw that years ago. I worked at Bureau of Mines long time ago, there would be these commodity-wide visibilities into this kind of issue that I don't know, the spooks and kooks would all go take that data and do whatever they want on their strategic planning. But there are different frameworks. Right now we look at industries, but the other side is maybe looking at, can we cut this stuff horizontally as well? But again, it comes down to if the tracking becomes, if the source tracking becomes a negligible expense within the total monitoring, so that value return for those companies basically to improve and get back to just in time, then you're in a position where you've lowered that resistance and the ability to move through and to participate more than just the big multinationals, but to start to get the smaller shops to get on board. And one of the key things, we see this, trade groups across, everyone is certainly talking about it. People are serious. They want to do this. But what is that additional ability to improve your market? Well, one of it is actually engaging that activist consumer, opening up, in theory, an additional 5% of your market. Now, there is this strategic opportunity in the U.S. Love him or hate this guy. He took advantage with SpaceX, a bit of an opportunity with some of the way the capital markets work in the U.S., and pretty much just blew up a problem, had his engineers rethink it, and I think that's one of the opportunity spaces, that you can fail fast, and I think there's an open space for some creativity in trying to provide these insights for the U.S. manufacturing community into the supply chains. You also have the issue, these mega capitalized corporations, vertical integration is the quickest way you're going to get to demonstrate that. You see some of those, Delta Airlines got into it in the oil and gas industry, lots of interesting lessons there. And you have other things that groups have tried to go vertical in different components, usually downstream, not so much upstream. But when they do, they've actually found technology and licensing opportunities there. And then obviously, the direct, the U.S. government's itch right now, making a lot of direct investments in the mineral resources sector. Mentioned the Canadian and Australian one, revisiting Mountain Pass, what they did when the Chinese tried to shut stuff off before, basically saber rattling. And as a geoscientist, though, I think one of the things too, the missing ingredient in our community is our geoscience community in the U.S. has been lazy about this. It just really isn't engaged, and this is a real shame. Something that we've been trying to encourage at AGI. But I think we do have an interesting opportunity because the U.S. National Science Foundation, which basically the research community in the U.S. Moves through, is currently in the process of having its budget tripled, and it's all the growth is in a division called TIP, Technology Innovation Partnerships, and it's all for once the U.S. is going to be establishing a focus on science technology application at government funding and resource level. So I think looking at a lot of the techniques, a lot of approaches here, and basically NSF trying to say, now we need to get companies involved across this entire area. We may have an incubator for the U.S. to actually become a bit of a player within this kind of space. So I will leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. This has been a sort of revelation for Europeans. The approach from over the ocean is quite different, more of a market-driven and less governmental and instrumental-driven. Are there any questions now? I think we can spend some time on questions from the audience. If we have any question for Chris or for the other presenters earlier, just shoot them. Vitor.
Yes, I have one. Chris, thanks for this brilliant presentation. One question about consumer.
Wait for the microphone because we have online participants.
Okay. So I'm Victor from the International Raw Materials Observatory. I have one question about what you call the activist consumer, because a problem that we face with raw materials is that they are integrated in other products. So you need to have some way of showing to people that the metals that are inside, let's say, the gadgets were sourced in an ethical way. And I wonder, do you have any clues for that? Do you see any solutions? Because I guess that this can also be said in the future that it's some sort of greenwashing, because it will be difficult to access. Thank you.
Yeah, you have to get over the cynicism. Yeah, that's a challenge. But I think we've seen a whole bunch of ideas, methods being proposed to actually document that. The difference is to get not just IBM and Microsoft and Google and Apple to say yes, that's one set, but to get a much bigger universe of manufacturers up and down the supply chain across a lot of different areas that basically now are engaging that. You have to pretty much have to make it that zero marginal cost with now the marketing opportunity, because you basically said, okay, you got 5% of the market that seems to be paying attention to this. This becomes a market advantage opportunity for folks. And so it's that cost drive down to then actually make that pitch. Yeah, it's hard to wave the cell phone, but if you start propagating it out enough, then it starts to becoming normalized. And I think this is one of the challenges. You don't see anything. No one actually is buying into a lot of the tech company stuff then you're also hearing about labor problems. That's where the cynicism comes in. But if you start seeing these standards, not just in cell phones or, these high profile, but across the space of goods, that starts changing the equation an awful lot. You normalize the concept. It's not, I think in the consumer space, I think in the mid-level and small-level manufacturing corporate space, it's not normalized yet. We have to get to that point. But I think the tools are there. Now we just have to find the ways to insert it, to motivate them, because it's going to be voluntary. In the US, it's going to end up having to be voluntary to some level. Free trade agreements will make it somewhat mandatory as they work across supply chains that are international. But, it's from that origin standpoint.
Thanks. Any other questions? Please.
Thank you, Louis Maréchal with the OECD. It's more of a comment or an addition, but I think it goes along the lines of what you just said, but I wanted to highlight the experience and the cooperation that we have with the London Metal Exchange, which has actually transformed those responsible sourcing requirements into market access requirements. And I think that's where you reach scalability, and this is where you actually start driving change across the industry and across sectors, actually. We've seen also with our experience that, the consumer demand for responsible products, as you highlighted yourself, doesn't drive much change. It's important to demonstrate that it's possible. We've been working for a long time with Fairmine and the likes, and Fairphone, for instance, is another good example. I think ultimately, personally, I think that the most systemic change is to be expected of industry, initiatives that will ultimately drive those responsible sourcing and transform them into a cost of business. And I think that's something that we've not reached yet. there's a comparison that I like using, and no one questions anymore personal protective equipment on mine sites. No one says, oh, why should I pay for that? Why should I pay for a helmet or boots? You just do it. And I think that's where I want to go. And honestly, we're quite far from that still, but there's been some very positive evolutions. And it needs to come from within the market, and it doesn't necessarily need to be like marketed, I think, actually, at the end of the day.
Thanks.
Actually, I have
Chris?
a question for Lawrence. So in your line of business, how much proactive work do you end up getting from corporations to sort of do some real advanced due diligence down their supply chain at some of these places to see if there are those issues, you know, the criminal issues?
That's a good question. The support is mixed. So some of the companies who are perhaps based in Europe or America tend to be more proactive. Those that are based in, say, the DRC or parts of South America are less proactive because the last thing they want is teams of forensic geologists advising them what to do because there are potential dishonest practices. So it's immensely variable, but the problem is analogous to the response you gave to the last question, which is it's what we're doing today and what we've done in the past few years is just raising the issue, getting it into the mindset of the corporate organisations, and hopefully in the years ahead that'll become embedded. And that was a great example of the PPE. You know, it's not questioned at all, yet there's a significant cost to PPE. And I think that's a fantastic analogy. And you know, if we can get there in 5 years, then we've been successful. Thank you.
Thanks. I have a bit of provocative question. Being European and looking at how you do stuff in US. I mean, at the end of the day, you say that people are aware of let's say, responsible resourcing or whatever material or coffee or beer they do, drink, eat, use, but it doesn't help to change their habits. So eventually it should be sort of institutional approach, shouldn't it? From, let's say, raising the taxes for non-responsible materials versus the responsible one? Or do you think there's another way which could be possible? But relating to that, you said yourself that US is engaging in trademark with market agreements and just pushing the responsibility to another countries and let them deal with that, and then we get the responsible material to US and we're clean. So basically, neither the government wants to dive into it, and even less the consumers.
Well, I think it's a matter of you have the price sensitivity, you know, which is always there, and the cynicism that was brought up earlier, but certainly in the current political environment, I mean, since Reagan on, a government-driven solution on that is not going to last. You know, and I think that's the issue in the U.S. But I think part of it is through the free trade agreements, because I think this administration actually is very serious about responsible sourcing. They're trying to figure out how to infect the system, and by having, you know, say having EU, the free trade agreement there, and knowing that part of that supply chain, but it also goes the other direction. Now those US companies have to start complying with the EU expectations. This is a way to propagate that through. With that, they're never going to get Congress to pass a law that says thou shalt, because believe me, the lawyers will be all over it in a heartbeat. But to the point where it starts happening, then you start changing the culture. I mean, that's what influencing market is just about changing culture. And it takes time, but it takes some success, and it takes a low barrier of entry to try to lift it up. And I agree, it's somewhere in the mid space. There are these concentration points, you know, like was brought up, you know, with the London Exchange, that you can make that push hard. But we've got to do it. You know, we're coming up with lots of ideas, but certainly from the U.S. perspective, it's going to have to be market driven, which just basically says it's going to have to change at the cultural level. And I think it can. I don't think people are going to disagree with the idea, but they're not going to pay, as has been demonstrated, they're not going to pay extra if they think they're paying extra for it.
Yeah, so it's a sort of bypass.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions for either of the presenters? Lawrence, for yourself.
Yes, to myself. To Chris, please. Many years ago, I did an audit of a mine in Kazakhstan. And I had to look at my calculations because there was no resource there. The amount of metallic minerals in the ground was negligible. And when we gave the report to the Kazakh government, they said, yeah, we know this. So why are you still operating the mine? Well, there's 30,000 people there, and if they don't mine the rock, they've nothing else to do. We have to feed them. And the point behind this story is I've worked at many artisanal mines around the world. Some are legal, some not. And the government know these are illegal, but it feeds the people. There's millions of people involved in illegal mining. These become illicit mines, not illegal. So the government kind of turns a blind eye to all this activity. So here we are as geologists and geoscientists trying to do the right thing and be responsible to check that the minerals are responsibly sourced. But what happens to the millions of people that rely on illicit minerals? How do we mitigate that? I'm not quite sure we got an answer, but I just wondered what your thoughts might be.
You know, I think every society does exactly what you're talking about. They just do it in different colors. I mean, we have that through a lot of our subsidies. You know, keeping industries going that, you know, the market should have extinguished a long time ago, but it does. It supports a lot of folks. I mean, that is, you know, and some of it lasts beyond when it's useful. You know, I think our agricultural industry has lots and lots of those subsidies and has propped it up. Same thing with our coal mining industry. Yes. But on the other side, our oil and gas industry still gets huge amounts. It's the largest producer in the world. You know, so but it was a view that it was dying, and it was some kind of investment for stability. You know, they're trying to keep a population employed. That's actually a security issue. I mean, and that's no different than the U.S. investing, putting in huge subsidies for the oil and gas industry, making sure it didn't go away because that was considered a security issue. So, I mean, I think everyone plays that game. Sometimes it's sort of ironic that you guys got brought in on that audit, you know, that would have exposed it. But I think that's just part of life, to be honest with you, and the challenges of civil governance.
In other words, it's not a reason for us not to be doing what we're doing today. I think. Okay.
Yeah. No.
It's more complex. It also brings social perspective to it, not only the criminal and.
Yeah.
Ebba?
Yeah. Thanks. I mean, Lawrence, I think you made a very important point, is that there is this social perspective. And perhaps one should make a distinction between an illegal mining activity, because they don't have the license, and the crime that, other types of crime that may be associated with it, such as extortion or whatever else it might be. And maybe that should be the focus, not stopping people mining illegally or maybe finding ways to legalize that. But stopping the crime that is associated with it. On the other hand, the problem is probably that this crime then moves somewhere else, because these cartels and so on, they're very flexible, they're very agile, I think is the buzzword these days, and they are faster than us.
This is why we, on one hand, want to advance applications of geology to law enforcement to get that edge. But these cartels are very sophisticated. Before you know it, they've got the advantage, and it's a constant cat and mouse game to try to keep one step ahead of them. Thank you.
Thanks. I think we had a question over here, and then the reply, and then we'll break for coffee, okay?
Just a quick follow-up on those points. Fully agree on illegal/criminal. Also keeping in mind that you have criminal activity in large-scale mining, in particular in South America. A tendency that we're seeing is large cartels investing in yellow machines, so heavy machinery on mine sites. So that changed the perspective and the picture. In terms of the ability to work with informal miners, that's a big chunk of our work at the OECD, and it starts with changing the optics on the artisanal small-scale mining sector. 6-7 years ago, the main line from everyone was, we don't touch ASM, period. We've made quite a lot of progress on that, in particular because of cobalt. Cobalt is 25% ASM sometimes in the DRC, so they actually don't have a choice. Companies do touch ASM, they just don't know it. And it's getting bigger. It's appearing in lithium now, it's in mica, it's in a number of supply chains. So there's actually not a lot of choice. You do have to engage with artisanal and small-scale mining. You just need to acknowledge it and find a way to make it more sustainable and less damaging to communities and environments. So I think we're slowly getting there, but it's going to take time yet.
Thanks. Chris?
Just a quick question for Lawrence. Thinking about your map of sort of corruption index, when you're looking across countries, are you finding that the crime rates are more similar by country across the commodities, or are there specific commodities, whether by country or across the board, that are real hotbeds in particular?
Both, depending on the commodity. So if you think of gold, for example, then that's global. When you think of a commodity like cobalt, then that tends to be DRC specific, or the tourmalines would be Tanzania or northeastern Brazil. So it is driven by the value of the commodity that the cartels then follow. That in turn is driven by the gold price. So we can see these trends.
Yeah,
Okay, thanks. Now we're going to have a half an hour break. Enjoy the coffee, enjoy sweets, and we return at 4:40, please. Thank you very much. Now we're going to start with the second session, and it's going to be a bit shorter. Only 2 presentations, but also very interesting ones. And after that, we'll have the roundtable discussion and some questions and answers. And now we again have the presentation from Dr. Lawrence Donnelly, and it's not going to be streamed online, so I do apologize for those that are connected via web, but that's life, so you can have a break for a longer coffee or a snack or something like that.
Perhaps not, address, but at least put on the table is who cares? So what? One of the, points to this whole conversation is the fact that an increasing number of stakeholders and participants across value chains are caring about minerals, where they come from, who gets access to them, how they're produced, how they're processed. And so that's why we wanted to ask this question of, okay, in the grand scheme of things, sourcing, traceability, responsible operations, but also responsibility across mineral value chains, across all these linkages and gaps where you can break off the transparency, chain, who cares? And what do they use the information for? More importantly, how is this reflected in policy and decision-making today? So I can kill you by PowerPoint after. I'm happy to share some slides. I actually gave a course on this to some unfortunate engineering students who most are still alive. But I thought maybe, again, we're all looking at this through different perspectives, through different aspects of our work. I'm a consultant. I advise on strategy, investment, policy, governance issues, both for investors and operators, but also for policy shapers. And if we look at the 2 sides of our equation, criticality and responsibility, what we are actually seeing is an evolution of how we make decisions, right? Criticality, we all know. I'm not going to reinvent the excellent presentations that have been done by every single participant at the International Roundtable on criticality. There is the axis of supply risk, economic importance, okay? How do we fold in the issue of sustainability? Usually, we define criticality, we make a nice list, and then we say, oh, and by the way, we should do this correctly. Usually, we are policy shapers that are quite distinct from the realities of producing countries. And that's quite important to note. So we think of criticality strategy as something that is essentially a buyer's game. First of all, that's no longer the case. Producing countries are adopting criticality strategies. Of course, with the exact opposite approach of saying, okay, what's critical to others, and how do we shape our national strategies and approaches? The other thing is that in criticality methodology today, we are seeing really the evolution of the conversation to a situation where we actually encompass sustainability and responsibility as a third axis. Is it me who's making all? Yeah, is that better? Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah. And so what I want to discuss with you is if we actually make responsibility, and responsibility encompasses ESG parameters in an operation, but also how every single level links to another, and this is where sourcing and therefore the transparency across the value chain kicks in. If we actually make that part of the criticality assessment, and you have methodologies that are starting to, not starting, you have methodologies that have defined since 2020 quite extensively how you could actually define criticality incorporating environmental risk, for example. There's an excellent approach that was suggested, interestingly, by Chinese academics using China as the case study to say, okay, if we define criticality as supply risk, economic importance, but also environmental risk, what do we get? We get no-go zones, or we get areas where even if we do try to address criticality, we have to do it with increased requests or requirements, and therefore that needs to trickle down the entire value chain. Needless to say, this is not yet adopted as a wide methodology. But the reason that's important is because it triggers two things. We look at sustainability or responsibility, first of all, in terms of how things are produced. The complexity there is that most of the policy shapers really hone in on mining, because mining is the visible one, right? Mining is where you can see the pit, you can see the damage, you can see the illegal operations, and frankly, you can also see when stuff has been produced illegally, because now, as was just explained by my colleague, you can literally scan it and go, no, actually, we know that's dirty. So the difficulty there is that we are completely missing the debate on midstream processing. Why are we missing it? Because, and this is what Mika will explain in more detail, that's where it's opaque. That's where you can't, get transparency. That's where you actually are, at the moment, collectively, we are failing to have clear views across entire value chains. Gold is important. It's not critical, right? When we start talking about some of these minerals, which actually do not come out of a mine, but come out as a secondary product, sometimes a tertiary product of processing, and we don't know where stuff has been processed, then all transparency, all traceability fails. Or we don't know how it's been processed. And more importantly, we don't know the sustainability of those operations, although sometimes we can take a guess and it's pretty disgusting. So thinking about responsibility as an integral part of criticality means we change the whole decision process. It also means that we look at midstream as the key lynch point that we need to be focusing our assessment on. Does it mean we let mining do whatever it wants? Of course not. but it means that we are aware and cognizant of the fact that whatever clean or sustainably produced goes into a disgusting, unmanaged, unexamined processing facility where forced labor could be the number one source, then we've lost control of that entire value chain. The other aspect that I think is important, and I'll wrap up quickly so that Mika can come in, is the fact that if we think about sustainability as an essential component and responsibility as an essential component of criticality, then of course we immediately raise the question of how we use these minerals. Again, what's the point of producing minerals in a very sustainable way in the perfect mine, processing them in a completely environmentally, compliant and ideal facility, and then putting them in a 2-ton SUV instead of public transport? Again, this is the question that we need to be asking because civil society are raising these questions. And I just want to put in the back of your mind the fact that there is no criticality strategy at the moment that has factored in a change of use, efficiency, mandatory criteria about what we consider the best use of minerals, with one exception. In the CRM Act, as revised by the Parliament, which probably will not be the final version, on which, by the way, I heard today there was a positive negotiation on Monday, so we should see the CRM Act come out pretty quickly. The Parliament changed the threshold and the target for recycling. It is intrinsically linked to all of this because by changing the way the target is defined, not as with annual consumption as the basis, but more as we have an obligation to refine up to, I think, 40% of the waste, of the mineral content of waste in Europe, but also we need to increase the recycling capacity by 10% based on current levels. That means that we are putting a huge amount of responsibility on industrials on how they use, and more importantly, on the recyclability of their product. So I know this all sounds really fluffy and disconnected from the harsh realities that we've seen, but the reality is if we have traceability capacity, and if we have responsible sourcing mechanisms, but there's no accountability because the final part of the chain, i.e. the industry that uses the minerals, actually is not held up to the standards we proclaim, then what's the point? And the only way to create that, increased accountability is to have more policy that focuses on industrial use and midstream and how midstream happens. So that's what, I work on. But also, this is where I'd like Mika to come in, because Mika has actually looked at both sides of this equation, and it's not a pretty picture. So good to know.
Thank you, Ludivine. I'll just stand here because then I can refresh my mind if needs be. Can I close this just? Or can I move this somewhere? Yeah, sorry.
Do you want to plug it in?
No, I just, in case I lose my train of thought. Ah oui, ça c'est bien aussi. Yeah, it's okay. So thank you for sticking around until the end of this. And I actually want to take us to an entirely different place, a place where we have not talked about, I feel, in anything that I've been hearing over these past 2 days. And that's actually the impact of regulation. At IPIS, we've actually been studying the real-life impact of resource governance, resource extraction on communities in producing countries in East and Central Africa for decades. And what we do find, unfortunately, that there's this really big mismatch, this really big gap between the intentions, the ambitions, all the good that we put on paper in regulations, and how that it's actually translated or manifested in the real-life context of people in these producing countries. And why is this important? Because actually improving conditions at producing levels in producing countries is the aim of many of these regulations. It's not only that we can sleep better at night as consumers, but actually, deep down, we also want to make a positive change in these producing countries. I'd like to take you to the example of the EU Critical Minerals Regulation, because that's one of the only regulations with mandatory due diligence on human rights and conflict financing that's already active at the moment. And I do think there are some lessons to learn. And so the EU Critical Minerals Regulation, or the EU Regulation on Responsible Sourcing from conflict-affected and high-risk areas of tin, tungsten, tantalum, and gold, 3TG. So that's the ambition of it, and really to make improvements to break the link between the extraction and the trade of these minerals and financing conflict in certain countries. And that's really the aim of this regulation. It aims to break this link by putting mandatory due diligence requirements regarding human rights harm and regarding conflicts financing on EU importers. It really focuses on these importers, the companies importing these minerals into the EU, but really with the idea that this would have a positive trickle-down effect along the whole value chain. That's not only at this point where these companies buy, that there is improved due diligence and there's improved awareness of responsible sourcing, but really that by imposing them there, due diligence along the chain would happen. That's really the idea. When the regulation was formulated, we were aware that there were certain risks for producing countries. We knew some of the effects of the Dodd-Frank Act, and we did not want to repeat them. Because there's actually, there are some risks for producing countries. The first one is, you have a nice regulation, but nothing changes. It's a very real outcome. And the second one is that there's change, but not in the positive direction that you actually intend. And that is very real with all these due diligence regulations, because they put extra requirement on companies, extra costs, extra risks, also risk for reputation. So for many companies, it's understandable that it is a more risk-free, a more cost-effective strategy to disengage from certain complex contexts, such as high-risk areas or such as artisanal mining. And in that way, if this risk materializes, actually the regulation is counterproductive to his ambitions, because then what leaves us are companies, if the companies with some intentions but not really seeing why to do it or a way to do it, disengage from a context, the companies that remain are often companies with lower standards or no human rights requirements. We've seen this happen. And in a way, minerals will find their way into the supply chain, just less regulated, less responsibly sourced. So there's two big risks. And that's why the regulation put into its text what we call this accompanying measures. These are measures that, on the one hand, accompany companies to stay engaged in these complex contexts. And on the other hand, also to accompany producers in these high-risk areas so that they're better prepared to sell their minerals to EU importers. So that's the theory. That's what it looks like on paper. So now, this regulation came into action in full action in 2021. So we're almost 3 years after that. And one of the things that we do is we really go on the ground and we try to see what is the impact, what is the result, and what do we see. Unfortunately, not much seems to have been changed at the producing level. We see very little that suggests that the bar has been raised on responsible sourcing, unfortunately. When we ask people at the source, this could be artisanal miners, for instance, in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, where lots of the 3TG minerals are produced. When we ask them if their working conditions are improved because there are more risk mitigation measures, they don't see that. They still sell their minerals, the same buyers still buy them, the same traders still put them in the system, whether illegally and illegally. The same systems are still in place. And why is that? Because we see that there's a lack of full transparency. Despite all the due diligence requirements put in place, it's still really hard for a company to know where actually their material is coming from, the real mineral origin. So it's actually really hard to know whether it comes from a conflict-affected or a high-risk area, and therefore it's really hard to know whether you need to put heightened due diligence in place, etc. And why is that? Because, of course, most importers don't go and buy directly from a mine. They buy from this midstream point that we've talked about a couple of times already. Smelters, refiners, where they are guaranteed some responsibility, traceability, but actually not full transparency. They're not given full transparency, if that makes sense. So in a way, as I'm going to say a positive side effect, this second risk of disengagement is not so much an issue at the moment, but because actually people are not knowing that their minerals are coming from these areas often. Therefore, they're also not disengaging from this area. So, but disengagement stays a really, really important risk for the millions of people, for instance, in artisanal mining who really depend on this sector, on this income for food, for basic needs, for shelter for themselves and their families. So it's something to consider still very much. What I personally think is equally worrisome is that when we talk to people, for instance, in geological surveys of African countries, is that hardly any of them have heard about these regulations. It's something a couple of my colleagues have been giving training to people from geological services, but also people from CSO and mining authorities, for instance, in Lualaba, Haut-Katanga in Congo, to really talk about, for instance, the EU battery regulation that has very concrete due diligence requirements on human rights and environmental and the environment. They've just not heard about it, let alone been consulted about it. And that's, of course, very problematic, because in this way, they also cannot, they do not know which standards that their minerals need to comply with. They don't know about rights, they don't know about responsibilities, and they can also not monitor these processes or accompany these processes or prepare themselves for these processes. So awareness is really something that we hardly, I feel, really hardly think about, and especially like adequate information sharing and knowledge raising is something we hardly think about, but it's so fundamental for the success of implementation and real impact. So I think this lack of awareness really also raises the question of what do rights mean when rights holders don't know about them? And when we don't put them in the position to help them get accountability from companies, from governments, from systems. So, as I said, the EU Conflict Minerals Regulation is one of the first of EU initiatives that wants to put due diligence, wants to improve the context in producing countries, wants to put due diligence, make it mandatory for companies. And therefore, I think there are some lessons to learn from this also for all these other initiatives that are still in the making within the EU. First of all, to make due diligence regulation more effective on really delivering impact, where it is intended, so also really at the producing levels, we really need to raise the bar on making producing countries, on making effective communities really partners in this conversation, and to put them in this position of accountability. We need to better accompany them. We need to help them prepare for all these regulations and how they can assist their companies, their communities to really implement these regulations in order to still have access to this market, right? Meaningful consultation, engagement, really dedicated awareness raising is really key to help people implement these standards and to help them monitor, as I said already. So we need to better accompany countries, affected people, but also truly companies. I think what a decade of voluntary due diligence principles have shown us really is that there's this tension between trying to avoid harm, trying to avoid risks, but still engaging in more complex contexts, because it is a good thing to do, or because there's no other option, for instance, with cobalt. This tension cannot be solved by the markets alone. We need active intervention, not at this moment. It's actually at the moment, it's the low-cost, low-risk thing to do is to disengage from a lot of contexts. So if we don't want to do this, then we need the EU and the member states to actively intervene to encourage companies to not go for this low-cost, low-risk solution. Another important point that we feel is that we also need to make more publicly aware, also to companies, that due diligence is a process, and a progressive process, and it does not require perfection from the start. So there's also the need to do a lot of awareness raising, a lot of knowledge sharing with companies, that it's important to have processes in place, to have systems in place, and to gradually work on them and improve them, and in that way, step by step, improve conditions and improve your responsible sourcing. We also really need to push for full supply chain transparency, or when we talk about due diligence, full value chain due diligence. Because without it, effects will not cascade down. That's been shown now by the EU conflict minerals regulation. We need to move away from only focusing on compliance, but really on true responsible sourcing, and what does it mean and what it can deliver. And lastly, it's also important that the EU and all the relevant authorities at the member states have the capacity and the staff, the competence to really monitor and enforce all these regulations, because it's nice to have these regulations, but if you cannot consistently enforce them, it becomes a very different and difficult game again. So I think I'll wrap up here, just as a first teaser. I've actually presented the work of one of my colleagues. She wrote a very interesting report about this. I have some copies with me. It's focused on this EU conflict minerals regulation. It's not the official review of the regulation, but it's a civil society review of this regulation. And whoever is interested, feel free to come and get a copy afterwards.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think it's very useful to also see like you say, the public part or public view on the conflict minerals and challenges related to them. Do we have any questions right away? Victor, please.
Yes.
Wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you. Yes, I'd like to raise two ethical issues. One to you, Mickey, and another one to you, Lawrence. Because Lawrence, you mentioned the case of the Peru mine. That was basically where this Swiss smelter was trying basically to assure that their gold was not coming from that location. And I wonder if, by doing that, if we are not condemning these people for eternal poverty, something like that. That's the question. And the other one, the reason why I'm asking this, it was because I was serving at the TFG board in 2014 to 2017 when the regulation, conflict minerals regulation, was approved. And we were basically lobbying with the Jesuit group in Brussels to basically providing advice to the European Parliament in favor of the approval of the regulation. But I went to Congo, to the DRC, a few months after being approved, that regulation being approved in Europe. It did not enter into force until 2021. But a few months after the approval, what the people in the DRC were telling me, the artisanal small-scale miners, was, now we are even poorer than we were before, because the European buyers also left. When the Dodd-Frank was basically shred, the Americans left, then the Europeans left. The only ones who did not left were the Chinese and the Lebanese. So an artisanal miner that was making $10 or $15 a day, now he was making less than $5 per day. So again, condemning people to eternal poverty. So these are two, I believe, two lines. How can we avoid that? That's the question. Thank you.
Could I add one line to that?
Yes.
We didn't stop buying tin, tantalum, and tungsten in the EU. So,
It's coming from China now.
yeah, well, we didn't stop buying these minerals. They come from somewhere.
Yeah, exactly.
So the great greenwashing, whitewashing, something washing of midstream worked its magic. But we were never held accountable for buying that.
But Lawrence and Nikki, how can we solve that?
Okay, great question, by the way. There's obviously no short answer and immediate response, but the comment I gave this morning of the mine I audited in Kazakhstan where there was no resource, but the Kazakh government kept it operational because it gave 30,000 people an income. And on one hand, we're trying to stop illegal and illicit gold. And I use the example of gold because I've got the data. We can talk about the critical raw materials. It's the same for them as well. On one hand, we want to do the right thing and ensure we source these minerals responsibly. So in Europe, it can ease our conscience and we can take some credit for doing the right thing. But then all of a sudden, 60,000 people at 5,000 meters above sea level in the Peruvian Andes can't sell their product because it's no longer coming to the European refineries. So what is a harsh word for them becomes incredibly harsher because of what we're doing here in Europe. And I don't know the answer, but I see it as an issue. The only thing I can offer and suggest is that we collaborate with parallel organizations who are trying to do the same thing. And by this, I'm talking about law enforcement, the financial markets, because it's through money laundering. And you gave a great example that we don't buy tin, tungsten, tantalum, but it still appears. We don't buy Russian material or material from the Taliban, but it still appears because it gets through the illegal trade routes that have been well established. So I think presentations like this, events like this, should become much broader in their scope to involve the other sectors like law enforcement and the money laundering experts. But other than that, I'm afraid I don't know what to do, but we need to find a solution.
That, or should we go to the next? Please.
But
Please.
I think it's really, it was at the core of what the message I was trying to convey is that we really should not disengage. We should really not disengage, and we should accept that a due diligence process is about identifying, preventing, mitigating, and remediating. Things will inevitably go wrong. And it's all about gradually, also, certainly in certain contexts, of gradually moving the bar upwards. It's not about, as I said, it's not about perfection, and it's not about because you cannot promise an entirely perfect system that you shouldn't do it. God knows, lots of miners are engaged in this. They don't have a perfect process, and they're still doing it, also large-scale miners. It should not prevent us, so it's really about not disengaging and accompanying also these countries to also be a stronger player in this, to have stronger demands, to have stronger monitoring themselves, and then to really deliver impact.
So it's a process. Ludwig, yeah?
This matters is because at the moment, Chile is working on its critical mineral strategy. South Africa is about to announce its critical mineral strategy. The EU is offering, as part of its strategic partnerships, technical assistance and policy dialogue for all of the resource-rich countries that it engages with to define their critical mineral strategy. For these countries, responsible sourcing is not a nice to have. It will be part of defining and designing sustainable mineral value chains for the future. So I think we will be seeing a whole new side of the responsible sourcing and of the sustainability parameters because the resource-rich countries are defining new strategies using criticality. So when you turn it around, the expectations are going to be much wider.
Thanks. Now we have a question from Maureen, then from you, and then from Eberhard. We have several key...
Actually, mine is a comment on this thread of conversation. So I'm Maureen Gallagher. I am, at least for the next 2 weeks, the interim director of stakeholder engagement for EFG. And I'm on a secondment from the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. So I am an ecologist, and I'm sitting back here in the corner thinking the next people you have to talk to are the ecologists, the wildlife managers, because all of the communities that, and I'm certain that all of the communities where you're having these issues with respect to mining are the same communities because they're so poverty-stricken. And they're in some of the most incredible places in the world where we have been working for decades with respect to wildlife trafficking, right? So the law enforcement infrastructure is already there. The discussions have been going on, like I say, for decades with these communities of how to address the poverty issues in order to reduce poaching and other adverse impacts on wildlife, right? That's before we even get to the huge landscape scale degradation that can happen from any of the mining operations. And so I'm glad to hear that there's some discussion, as I've been waiting all afternoon, for a discussion about how do we talk to people other than just the folks in the geosciences, right? It's where are the sociologists, where are the ecologists? Let's get them in the room.
A quick
response.
Yeah, response.
Interpol already have a team that are looking at fisheries, ecology and the environment and mining together, as to the Brazilian Federal Police, and that involves wildlife crime as well. So in law enforcement it's happening, but I think you're absolutely right, we need to do the same in our world.
Thanks. Please.
Follow up on that. I mean, that's what increasingly stakeholders are looking at, is crime convergence. It only makes sense because to access the gold, you need to chop off the trees and kill whatever animal you have around, and you're better off selling them onto the market before you access the... And all those communities still don't talk together enough, so that's something that needs to be worked out. Just on access to ASM, connecting various comments, ASM material is reaching international markets, whatever people want to, how much they would like to stay away from it. It actually connects producing countries and consuming countries. In 2019, we put out a report looking at ASM supply chain, large-scale mining supply chains in Congo. A number of companies, up until recently, were saying, we only get material from large-scale mining operations because we know it's safe, blah, 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 blah. We produced that report specifically to highlight the fact that those two supply chains are actually heavily interconnected because it goes to China. So the only way you're going to actually understand whether you're sourcing from ASM or LSM is through meaningful due diligence. One very recent anecdote that I'll share with you, and it's public information. So the LBMA, the group of international gold refiners, annually report on their sustainability objectives. They've just reported this year, I won't go into the details, like because of enhanced due diligence expectations on their gold refiners, they have uncovered that their gold refiners are actually sourcing double the amount of ASM material that they thought it was, from 30 to 60 tons. And it's probably much more than that, just by doing proper due diligence. So that production reaches international markets, including our countries. It's just that we don't know about it. I'm oversimplifying a bit, but it's absolutely true.
Please.
I would like to add a pinch of salt in the discussion that we see. So all of these southern countries that are heavily depending on mining. Mining didn't start recent years. Actually, they have been mining for centuries. And you see European countries that started this, taking all of the high-grade deposits and then profiting a lot from all of this production, and now trying to block this, move it away. Especially, you can claim the case in Bolivia or Peru that you mentioned, Peru, that you're leaving people with very low-grade deposits without any training, without any ability to do that they cannot produce it. So I think it's, yeah, you're throwing those people to the lions that they will not be able to keep mining all of that. And they'll say, okay, we keep with large mining companies, but still, if you look, large mining companies are still from global north. So the profit stays in the global north, and then, yeah, you leave the people there. So I would like to see that, yeah, what's the discussion about this, to actually bring the standard, but also manage the people to reach the standard, and not say, okay, you need to do this, and then, yeah, do it yourself, whatever you need to do to reach that place.
Thanks. Mika, quick reply.
What you were sharing just made me think of one of what we think is also the obvious thing to do, is actually increase the number of refiners and smelters in producing countries, so that not all value is taken out of it to some place where things get mixed and then sent on. It really would shorten the supply chain, and it would actually make it easier to get transparency on this supply chain. I just thought of this.
The challenges are water and energy. Yeah.
Everywhere, no?
Okay. Eberhard, I think it was you, and then Vitor.
It comes back to the point I was making earlier. I'm wondering whether we are not just too ambitious, which then results in disengagement. Because if we just say, well, this supply chain or this supply web, I prefer to use the word web actually, is not kosher, and then we stop engagement with those, that leaves a lot of problems behind, and it doesn't actually change the driver for those activities. So maybe we should actually focus on what we really are concerned most about. Is it the crime? Is it the crime, as I was referring earlier, like extortion? Or are the social conditions? If I'm trying to get everything in one go, that obviously results in disengagement, because we cannot solve these problems very quickly, because this is not a market problem that we are solving here, but this is a whole societal problem. And so maybe we should be a bit less ambitious and focus on something that is creating additional problems in the countries or for ourselves. Because a lot of those illicit activities are linked. I was glad in your second presentation you mentioned UNODC, because they have recognized that drugs are related to other types of illicit activities, like illicit trade in forestry products and also in minerals now. And they switch very quickly. So perhaps we should really focus on the most criminal activities first, and then we have a better chance in maybe solving the problem.
Thanks. I think Mika has pointed out it's a process. It's not 0 or 100, so it can also be somewhere in between, and it's a long process, I would guess.
Yeah, but we are always surprised that it doesn't work, because we are too
overambitious. Because we are oriented on yes or no answer. Vitor, please.
Yes, I'd like to address your comment, because you put, in my opinion, a lot of salt in the discussion. And my perception is that sometimes people and us in Europe, we do believe that we are living still in a sort of global order, where we are still leading that order. And the world is not like that anymore. We are going into a fragmented order, where things will be more, I'd say, decided on a bilateral basis. And but there are good examples also coming from the south, and sometimes we tend to forget those. A good example is from Burkina Faso, and again about artisanal small-scale gold miners. And Burkina Faso decided to have an agency, a government agency, that was buying the gold from the artisanal small-scale miners, telling them that they are obliged to sell the gold to that agency, but they are paying a premium for the price. So the agency is not paying the market price, not even the a value below the market price. They are paying above the market price. So everyone wants to sell to the agency. And because of that, they control all the trade of gold extracted in Burkina Faso. Of course, this was 3 years ago. I don't really know how it is now. It might change because, again, in this environment, sometimes the politics change quickly and everything changes. But putting always the responsibility on the north, it might also not to be a solution because we need to help the south to reinforce their own organizations and structures because these are the key. Thank you.
Thanks. Please.
Thanks. Some reactions again on Burkina Faso. Sadly, that agency never really went into operation, and now it's completely dead. No one was selling. I mean, in the gold market is a bit specific. Even if you pay a good price, you always find a criminal that's going to pay more because of money laundering. So sadly, Burkina is they've tried it, but it didn't work. On being overly ambitious, that's really a key point for us. That's something that we're trying to draw the attention of policymakers on. It's very good to have extremely high ESG ambition. The question is, how do you get there? If it's an entry requirement, no one's going to invest. No one's going to get the material. It's going to go somewhere else. It's going to go into international supply chains, but you won't see it. You need to have ambitions and a roadmap to help local stakeholders go from A to Z, because otherwise, again, no one will invest and people will start looking somewhere else. That's what we're seeing at the moment. There's a big rush to Australia, Canada, US, to some extent Europe, because there's a perception that you don't have any kind of risk in those jurisdictions. It's not true, but there's this perception. On local value added, it's true, it should be a legitimate objective, building refineries. I don't necessarily believe it will drive transparency. Again, if I look at the gold sector, you have a huge network now of local refineries that are being developed. That's all financed by politically exposed persons. They don't care a minute about transparency, integrity, accountability. It just offers a very nice window for international actors saying, oh, I'm buying from that legal entity in whatever country, therefore I'm clean. But no one's looking further down. That's the issue and the risk that we have with the DRC and a number of other countries. So, of course, it's a valid policy objective, but watch out. You have underlying risks behind that. I mean, if you look at what's going on in DRC, Zambia, they want to set up a special economic zone. We've done work on free trade zones, and thanks for highlighting that in the material that you've shown. No one knows what's happening in free trade zones. So it's a gigantic laundering box most of the time. So again, nice policy objective, but watch out what you're asking for.
Thanks. Can I ask our online participants to type in any questions they might have? This is the last chance because we are slowly concluding the session. We still have the concluding remarks by Vitor, and we'll give them a couple of minutes. Are there any other questions or comments? Please. Nathan.
I wanted to comment just about the idea of beneficiation and building refineries on site. In general, it has had a lot of positive impacts when I've experienced it. But one thing to just be aware of is that actually size matters. I've seen two examples. One of a site that was built with investment from local government. And that seems to be operating fairly well, but the foreign company that's operating it has traditional market pressures. But what I've seen in places in South America is when you build refineries that are too large, what happens is they start out with sort of ambitions of being traceable, responsible, but then they have to operate at capacity. And if the capacity is too large, then they'll just take anything. And they're hard to move. You can't really move a refinery very easily. And so building up local capacity, one piece at a time is is a bit of a challenge, and maybe there's a solution in smaller or more mobile setups or things like that. But I think that it's just something to be aware of if you're pushing beneficiation. Like, you do want value to remain there, but you also don't want it to be at leaving sort of this liability and this demand for bringing up whatever is available.
Yep. Thanks. Ludivine, please.
To rebound on what you were saying, all the bad lessons of 3TG have been learned in critical minerals, right? Whether it's manganese, lithium, all of them are now done illegally, done outside the norm, showing up in our value chains. And actually, the local value addition conversation has also picked up on this notion of saying critical minerals will come in smaller shapes and sizes than the biggest, best model of copper and iron ore. And so if we want to be able to capture those flows, one of the options is doing much smaller units with more of a cluster effect. At the moment, it's not working at all because investment doesn't like investing in the plant separately from like a clear market outlook. But I think you're right. I think it's a real option, particularly in the critical mineral space. So let's work on it.
Thanks. I hear that we don't have any questions from the online participants. So thanks to all for this quite interesting discussion. Yeah? Please, don't be afraid.
I was just wondering, because it seems like there's been a lot of emphasis on artisanal mining and the problems associated there, but I wonder if that doesn't leave like a big amount of unregulated spaces. So looking at commodity traders and some of these bigger mining actors in DRC that are assumed to be unproblematic, but actually have been quite involved in displacing communities, polluting the local environment, and actually operate with very little oversight for similar reasons that the ASM sector operates with very little oversight. So I wonder then if these are not going kind of under the radar because they're assumed to be clean or sustainable, and can also define what that means for themselves. Thanks.
Thanks. I guess who wants to address that, please? Also you, Mika, right?
Yeah. That's the point I was making earlier on. I mean, for years, companies downstream have been saying we're sourcing from large-scale mining, we're off the hook. I mean, the OECD guidance and ensuing regulations apply to ASM and LSM. They cover corruption, which is in our view, the biggest risk looming over the transition, because it's perceived as a victimless crime, but it actually enables all sorts of criminal activities and impacts. So corruption and security conditions around mine sites is another critical aspect that's currently being completely overlooked. So if you don't have public or private security forces that are able to maintain public order in a responsible way, for the lack of a better word, you're going to create tensions, you're going to create massive killings, South Africa some years ago, and that's also going to create all sorts of risks. So I mean, from the OECD perspective and all industry associations and regulations perspective, large-scale mining is very much on the radar as well.
Thanks. Mika, last comment, and then we'll pass the mic to Vitor.
It's actually something I wanted to say as a concluding remark after all your comments. Is there's actually what's been said as well is, I do not want to give the impression that ASM is the only problematic sector indeed. Actually, the most of the work that I personally do is around large-scale mining and all the impacts of large-scale mining on adjacent communities, and that's not a pretty picture neither. It really isn't. They just sell it better.
Thanks. So thanks again for the lovely, lively discussion. Vitor, I guess the honor to conclude before my concluding remarks and thanks is on you. So please.
Yes, I just want basically to say that Thank you, Anita. This is a more complex topic than it looks at the beginning. And I believe this is something that we all realize together. And the issues that we need to address are also difficult to solve. So we don't have any clear solution in the horizon. And if you put on top of this the political level, where we have decisions like the energy transition, that it's now moving the European policy forward, you realize that sometimes intentions, or the best intentions, might have bad results. I guess that this is the case of the challenges, or the reason why we have having these challenges with the critical raw materials all over Europe now. And it's also interesting to realize that we have these discussions about if we don't source from outside, we are condemning the others for poverty for a very long period. And at the same time, we also have difficulty sourcing domestically. We didn't talk about that. But the mining industry is also being labeled as neo-colonialist, because the industry goes to the south, to this global south, it's taking their wealth from there, but at the same time in the US or in developed countries or in Europe, we don't want to mine domestically. So we prefer to have this combination. And sometimes, I also see people that they believe that in order to be greener, it's sufficient to buy a new electrical car. And this is not the right message. So all these things are very complex, and even well-intentioned politics have difficulties. In between, I prepared a Mentimeter in case you have like 3 minutes just to collect your opinions with just 3 questions. Do you want to test it?
Yeah. Of course.
If you say no, that's fine. I know it's the end of the afternoon. We probably have drinks down below. So please go to menti.com and put the code, or just use your phone. You can answer together with Glenn. Okay. You can also screen the QR code. I'll scan the QR code. Are you there? Coming? Okay. Okay, take your time. So that's the code, menti.com, and it will be...
You need
no,
to change?
I just need to pass to the next slide, which I don't know how to do in your computer, Anita. Okay. Okay, yeah. So, no. So, sorry, present. Exactly. Okay. Okay. Oh, you're already responding. Beautiful. Because you enter and you have seen the questions, right? Yes. Okay, so we have 3 questions there. The first one is about tracking technologies. And the question is, are they essential enablers? Yes or no? Because in these discussions, we also have seen solutions where people are the key. The second one is, how will be the future in 15 years from now? Will these things be widely adopted? And finally, was this session valuable to you? And I guess that one is more consensual. Thank you. So 4.5, it's a good. And this is it. So thank you for attending. I believe this gives us ground for next discussions and events. And it's my pleasure to close and to hand it back to you, Marco.
Thanks. I don't need that one. I have this one. I have a personal thank you very much. Just to conclude, big thanks to everybody, to presenters, to co-organizers, the initiative on Forensic Geology, the EFG and Intro, and all presenters made their effort, a really good effort, for having an interesting session and for your feedback, questions. I think it went rather well. I would also like to thank Anita, because she's been in the back all the time. But honestly, without her, we would be sunk in the first 5 minutes. So thanks, Anita. You do deserve a big applause. Yeah. And with that, I conclude today's afternoon. It's been long 4 hours. Hopefully, they've passed quickly. And I wish you a pleasant remaining of the day, a week, And I'm positive we're going to meet again because this is a topic that needs to be addressed more often and in larger scale in the future. Thank you.